I'm Abby.
And I'm Tim.
I'm the daughter.
And I'm the father.
And us with our families are Foundation Homestead. And today we're going to start the first of our barn tours, and the one we're going to see first is right down the road. So let's go see what we can find.
Stewardship is everything.
This is our first barn in our barn tour. It's not very far from our house, so we can actually see our farm from here. And one of the first things we tried to do with the barns is figure out how old they are. And the people who know that, most of them are already gone, so we can't just go and ask them. But one of the first things that you can do to figure out the age is to kind of look around the area. And what we have here in this area is the Republican River.
So why is the river significant? Well, it's significant because when Nebraska was settled, the river had no timber on it. And since this structure is made of wood, as virtually all the barns around here are, that wood had to come from someplace. Nebraska got its statehood in 1867, and there's two ways it was settled. The one was through the Homestead Act. A great deal of land was settled through that, and the other was through the railroad. And most materials had to come into this area on the railroad. And the railroad was given 12,800 acres for every mile of track that they laid. And they resold that land to people that wanted to settle the area, and they did so at a reasonable rate because those settlers became customers. And so this wood had to come from someplace, so more than likely this structure could not be more than that age. But it's not that old, and here's some of the reasons that we know why. If you look at the top of the barn, you'll see a structure up there with a track that's sticking out over the top. A lot of people call that a cupola, but I think it's best known or best termed as a hay prow, P-R-O-W, which comes from the shipping industry, and you can kind of see how that would be the bow of a ship. Well, the reason that's significant in aging a barn is because that's indicative of the kind of hay that they put up in the mow, or whatever material they put in there, and we're assuming that it's hay. And hay that was put in a mow had to be cut somehow. Might have been cut by hand with a sickle, might have been cut by a tractor-driven sickle or a horse-driven sickle or whatever it is. But the case is that that gives an indication of the time and the age in which the barn was built, or that wouldn't have been up there.
Now let's go inside and see what other clues we can find. So we come inside, we have another clue here that this barn was used to house horses. And the way we can tell that is how wide the stalls are. You wouldn't need them this wide for cattle. This is for horses. And then the other clue is each one of the stalls has these hooks that they used for tack. And just a side note, that at the door, it's 8 foot, and where I'm standing now is 7 foot, so I'm on 12 inches of manure.
So now that we've discovered the horse stalls, it is most likely that this farm was initially farmed with horses. So that gives us another clue as to how we might date this structure. Now that's not necessarily foolproof, but it's like any kind of detective work. You start looking for the accumulation of evidence that it occurred at a certain time. So these are horse stalls, no question about that. It's likely that it was farmed with horses, so that helps us date when tractors became prominent in this area. So to look for more clues, let's go upstairs, which is kind of a sketchy thing to do. We go through this door. Actually, before we go up there, this was kind of a tack room, and if you look on the floor, you can still see some of the harnessing that's been left behind. But that area might have been a tack room, might have also been a granary to store grain for the horses or the cattle or whatever else is around here. And incidentally, before we go upstairs, I just noticed this. Here's a license plate, Nebraska 1928. Now that's a good clue. It doesn't mean that this existed before the barn was built and maybe it was bought into the barn. But again, this is one piece of evidence that kind of starts closing in the possible date range in which this structure could be built. So this is how we get upstairs to the hay mow. And you can take a look at that, and we'll try to navigate it here. We survived navigating the steps, but just because we're up here doesn't mean that there aren't other things that we need to be careful of. The first thing I noticed is the barn door is hanging on up there, and the only thing that's holding it in place is that little board in the corner is catching one corner of the door, and that's what keeps it from coming in. And the other thing is this wire right here. That's what keeps it from going out. So that's pretty sketchy. The other thing that we need to notice is that this barn is not far from falling down, because if you come over here and look at this, from right there at the bottom of that wall all the way up to the peak, the roof is not connected to the wall. So that wall is just standing there. The other side is still connected, so that's holding it in place. But that wall basically could come down at any time. It still has these braces, and they look like they're intact, but it doesn't seem like it'd take much of a windstorm to bring this one down. One of the other fascinating things about hay barns, or the barns of yesterday, is the hay trolleys, which existed in most barns. And of course, this was indicative of the hay prow that we looked at outside. And the hay trolley was an integral part of getting hay into the hay mow or hay loft. And the way that this would work is the first thing they would do is they would take the hay trolley up to the door. They would hook the rope onto the door, and they would use the hay trolley to open the door. Otherwise it would just fall, and the impact would take it clear off its hinges. So once the door is open, the hay trolley would go out and pick up the hay. One of the things we know about this hay trolley is that this is designed for loose hay, which gives us a little suggestion as to the dating of this barn, because I'm sure this is original to this structure. So we know that that's designed for loose hay, and in case there was a question, there's another clue that we found up here. And this is kind of surprising that this is still around, but this is part of a hay sling. And the way that this would work is that these would be laid out on the hay rack from the front to the back, and the hay would be loaded. More than likely, by the age of this barn, it would have all been done by hand. And once there was about a 2-foot layer of hay on that, they would put another sling on top of that, fill it up with hay, another sling, fill it up with hay, and most of the time 3 layers is about as much as they did. And then they'd bring it to the hay barn. And once it was out there, then this trolley would go out, it would drop down, and somebody on the outside would have to have this trip rope. And this trip rope served 2 purposes. One was it pulled it back along the track up above, and once it got to the end, it would trip, it would drop down, they would hook it onto the hay slings, and that would come up and it would cradle all of that hay. And the reason that people like the hay slings is because it didn't lose quite as much. When you put a hay fork, which was also a very common way, the hay fork would go in from the top, and as it was going up, a lot of times the hay would continue to drop down until it got into the barn. So the hay slings were very efficient for that. Okay, so what we've gained so far is that Nebraska got its statehood in 1867, and this barn was used primarily for loading loose hay. So if you take 1867 and then you go up to where baling and tractors became predominant, we're looking at about the middle of the 1930s, but that's still a 68 year span, so we'd like to shorten that up. We know it wasn't the furthest this way, 1867, most likely it wasn't the furthest this way, but someplace in between. So our objective is to shorten up this time span and see if we can get a little bit closer. So the thing is that the best information for determining this is up there. Since I couldn't find any volunteers, I guess I'm the one going up. And there won't be much talking on the way. There might be some screaming and hollering, but we'll deal with that as it comes. What I'm doing now is trying to find the name and perhaps a patent number on this trolley. There have been lots of pigeons up here and possibly some barn owls because there's blood on the floor beneath me. I don't want to mingle mine with it. And this is pretty cool. Kids, don't try this at home.
As with all things that have moving parts, that requires maintenance. And from the loft floor to the peak of the barn is 20 feet. So this rope also served for another purpose, that when it needed worked on, they'd bring it over to, you can kind of see the ladder here, and then get up on the platform, and that's how they would work on the trolley system.
One of the reasons that we want to do the barn tour is to feature the construction work that's done in these old barns. One of the things that we need to be familiar with, that these were an integral part of settling this part of the country, and they were so important that most of the time the barn got built before the house got built, because the cattle, the grain, the hay, these were all their assets that they had to protect. So the craftsmanship of these barns in this particular area of the country, and perhaps other places as well, there were many of these barns all going up at the same time. Now, since there weren't that many contractors around and probably couldn't afford to hire one anyway, most of these barns were built by the people that lived on this property. So it would work with the neighbors that I'll help you build your barn, you help me build mine, And that's how all of this work got done, and it's really quite an amazing feat that they accomplished. So the structure of this barn, the first thing that I think of when I look at these is that this was all done with hand tools. And the construction of these rafters were probably laid out on the ground. They were nailed together, and then they were raised up into place. They were all tied together, and they'd start at one end and just gradually work to the back. And the rafters are made out of 2x6s, and they're placed on 2-foot centers. And you'll notice that every rafter is setting on top of a stud. These are 2x6 studs. And this barn used a method that's called balloon framing, which means that the stud goes from the top plate clear to the concrete footing down below. So it's very solid that way, and this barn has stood, we're guessing right now, it's in the neighborhood of 100 years old, but we'll give you more about that in a little bit. So these rafters were all cut, they were lifted into place, they were set down, and there's places in this barn you can still see the pencil marks where the rafters were set. And if you look up above there, the way that they tied or strengthened the joinery for where those two rafters came together is another 2x6. And I would guess they're about 6 feet long, and they're nailed into the rafters, and that's what gave them their strength. And then at the top, the rafters were tied together with another brace, collar brace that's put at the top, and of course that's what's used to support the track for the trolley. So this was all constructed, and as we mentioned earlier, all of these materials had to come in on rail or on car and wagon or whatever, we don't know for sure. But nonetheless, they didn't come from, they're not native to this area. So this is a very characteristic feature of barns in our part of the country. Now let's go downstairs. There's a couple other things that we want to show you before we're done. And once we get down there, we'll turn this back on, and whatever you do, I don't know, you're gonna, you know.
One thing we know about this part of the barn, barn actually has two lean-tos, one on the west and one on the east. And there's these hooks up here on the ceiling. It has, I'm not sure, another hook, but they were a pulley system that would have been used to bring in grain and feed for the horses. And on the other side of here is where those horse stalls were. And there's a feed trough here. The other thing it would have been used for was to move manure, and it would have been taken out the south side of the barn.
There's one other little detail that I wanted to point out, and if you look close you can see some of these that just indicate that people took pride in the work that they did. One of the little details is right here above the windows. It's that little thing that actually serves no structural purpose. It's just design, and it dresses up the window quite a bit. I'm sure it looked quite attractive in the day. And that again just indicates that they took pride in their work and they wanted it to look good when they got done. Well, just like this old barn, this is a very common sight in our part of the country. They're falling down, and the reason is primarily because they're not useful anymore. So if a farmer's taking their hard-earned money, most of the time they're not going to invest it in a barn or a building that they can no longer use. And just the change of the farming practices, there's no way to get equipment in here to store it, and haying process is completely different. So most of these old barns are falling down, and we just want to take an opportunity to capture some of that craftsmanship that's left in these old barns. And as far as how old it is, our best guess is the research that we did on the trolley that's in the barn was not manufactured until 1910. And from the license plate that we found at the bottom of the steps being 1928, it's a good chance that it falls in that 17-18 year period. We did find another license plate from 1927, and our home down the road was built when? 1923. So that's a good guess. It's right in there. So this old barn has stood here for, if not 100 years, perhaps just a little bit more.
So thanks for coming along with us on our first barn tour. We hope you join us again on the next one coming soon. Like and subscribe, and so you don't miss any of it. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.